To my usual viewers, hey, it's been a while, at least on this channel. New video on the main channel later this week, so make sure you tune in for that. Okay, now let's talk about fucking Bubsy.
Bubsy is back!
I've been going on a bit of a Bubsy arc this year, which is something I did not see coming, like, at all. I bought and played like 20 hours of the recently released Bubsy collection for some reason. I even beat all the games, except for the Game Boy one. Yeah, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing But besides just going through all the old games, I've also been very excited for the upcoming second attempt at a Bubsy revival, this time by Atari and Fabraz, that being
Bubsy 4D!
Ever since the trailer dropped, I just knew there was something special here. I just couldn't prove it myself. However, there were some rumblings of a public demo being released a few weeks back, and I had a feeling that was probably gonna happen. And lo and behold, it did. So I have now played the first 3, I guess kinda 4, levels of Bubsy 4D. And what a surprise! It's peak. I can't remember the last time I had this much fun with the movement of a 3D platformer. Genuinely, it might be Mario Odyssey, which was 8 goddamn years ago. It's truly the best of both worlds in terms of movement as well. Not only does Bubsy's moveset work perfectly fine for a slower, more laid-back approach to its levels, but it also lets you fly through them and perform downright insane skips to try and reach the goal as fast as possible. The game actively encourages players to do both of these playstyles as well, with one goal being to look around the level for all the collectibles, and another being to beat the level within a certain time limit. The term movement slop gets thrown around a lot about Bubsy 4D, which is basically just a way to say the game has broken movement and completely negates the platforming level design. But the incentives to collect everything mean that you're probably going to be playing these levels the normal way at least once or twice, which I think is a good balance. It's not a perfect demo. I ran into a few questionable moments along my playthrough. What the fuck? But overall, all Bubsy 4D's demo did was make me more excited for the full release. With that being said though, there is one issue about the game's core level design that I do have, and I'm definitely not alone on it.
The demo stages are populated with plenty of steep jumps and acrobatic challenges, but there are very few enemies wandering around. And those that are present are brain dead and quite easily dispatched.
I almost forgot, the woolies actually do show up in the levels. There are some enemies that you get to deal with, but they're really just kind of there as another thing to lock onto and pounce at.
That's right, it's the enemies. Alright, so the main enemies in Bubsy 4D, at least in these first 3 levels, are the woolies. The main enemies from the first Bubsy game and Bubsy 3D. As well as the woolies strike back, but I mean, we just don't talk about that fucking game. Jesus Christ.
Compared to Gunboat Depravation.
As it was mentioned in the IGN clip, there are very few enemies around these levels. Now, I know these are the first 3 levels, so expecting this insane challenge or anything is pretty stupid. But even with that in mind, it feels like there are so few woolies here that it's, even for the first world, too easy. It doesn't help that the woolies themselves are barely threats even when you do run into them. Like, they spot you, they run towards you, dive and fall on their stupid faces, and that's it. I'm sure they'll become harder as the game goes on, so maybe this isn't much of an issue, but at the very least, the enemy count should absolutely be higher in these levels. The speedrunning and time trial aspects of Bubsy 4D are so important to its core design that you kind of need to be able to mostly ignore the enemies in order to get those fast times without being slowed down by unnecessary combat. And while that works fine for when you're actually going fast, it does make the moments where you are taking it slow feel a little underbaked compared to what they could be. It's also very important to note that even when you're playing the levels normally, there is genuinely no reason to actually stop and kill the enemies. You can very easily ignore them, and since they aren't tied to any sort of progression, there are 0 repercussions for doing so. Okay, so what's the core issue here that we need to solve? Basically, it boils down to the enemies in Bubsy 4D need to be more engaging, plentiful and important while you're playing the game normally, but still be mostly ignorable when you're speeding through the levels trying to beat the time trials. While this might sound a little hard to solve, I actually think there's a pretty easy solution for all of this. When people bring up games that are similar to Bubsy 4D, the number one answers I hear are always Mario and Sonic, which, like, yeah, that makes sense. However, I think there's a game series that this game shares even more DNA with that I see barely anyone talk about in reference to Bubsy 4D. And that would be a little game series called... The original Spyro trilogy and Reignited are some of my favorite games of all time, blending the collectathon genre with super fun movement, enemies, and exploration. At first glance, these games and Bubsy 4D probably don't look like they have a lot in common, but they actually really do. We're going to be talking about the first Spyro game here specifically, because while the other two games are similar, they also have a lot more going on in terms of mini-games and alternate playstyles. While Spyro the Dragon's levels are a lot more open and less linear compared to Bubsy's, they still feature a somewhat linear path to an end goal that teleports Spyro back to the hub world. Everything else around that path is simply areas to explore and find collectibles in, mainly being gems. Bubsy 4D also has the same structure, just presented in a different way. Since this game is designed around its speedrunning and time trials, each level has a very linear main path that's easy to follow, and leads right to the goal. With that in mind though, there are still many areas in these levels that are off the linear path and are solely for exploration and finding collectibles, just like in Spyro. Speaking of collectibles, each level in Spyro has a set amount of gems to collect that is forever remembered by the game. Once you collect a gem, that gem is forever gone from that level on your save file. These are not like Mario's coins and Sonic's rings. These are permanent collectibles. That's actually exactly how Bubsy 4D handles its yarn balls as well. Once you collect one, it's gone forever and saved to your save file. Even the way the yarn balls are laid out around the levels is quite similar to Spyro's gems, just lacking the chests and breakable objects that give variety to gem collection. Both Bubsy 4D and Spyro have a few other collectibles besides gems and yarn balls. And in the case of Spyro, there's always a main set of collectibles that is required for progression that you can get a few of in each level. But at their very core, these are both games where you run around areas, collect shit, and eventually reach a goal that lets you progress further. So, since both of these games have very similar structures, how does Spyro not fall into the same issues that Bubsy 4D has with its enemies? Well, it's simple. Killing enemies is required for 100% completion in Spyro. Not only do Spyro's levels have way more enemies, making the areas feel less empty, but killing them drops gems. This means if you want to collect every gem in the levels, you need to go around killing all the enemies in said levels. Killing enemies doesn't take them out of the game forever either, since unlike standalone gems, enemies will respawn after you kill them and then come back to the same level. They just don't drop the gems anymore since, once again, they are permanent collectibles. On top of the enemies in Spyro being mandatory to find and kill for 100%, making them part of the collectathon, they also have a lot more variety in how you deal with them. Obviously, I have no idea what the enemies are like in the later levels of Bubsy 4D, so this may be a useless tangent, but stick with me here. Spyro has two main moves in his moveset meant for attacking. He can breathe fire, and he can charge his horns towards enemies. Most of the enemies in Spyro can be dealt with either way. However, there are some enemies that can only be killed one way or the other, which the game quickly teaches you over the course of natural gameplay. Enemies with shiny metal armor or shields can only be dealt with by charging at them, and enemies that are bigger than usual can only be dealt with by fire. This simple addition makes the combat way more engaging without overcomplicating anything. It is genuinely perfect. Okay, so Spyro was able to make the enemies in combat work a lot better while basically having the same foundation as Bubsy 4D. How can we then apply these bits of game design to Bubsy 4D to make the game an overall better experience? I've broken it up into two different sections. As far as I know, Bubsy 4D is currently content complete, and the only work being done on it now is essentially polish and making the game as good as it can be without requiring a buttload of extra work. Gotta stick within the budget and all that. Section A is designed with this limitation in mind, and just makes easy changes to the enemies that would make the game way more engaging, while also making sure the speedrun experience isn't tampered with at all. Section B introduces a few new ideas that may require model tweaks to some woolies and other small bits of work that go outside of the scope of simple changes, so they're definitely more long shot suggestions. Got it? Let's go. Section A. Change 1. Increase the number of enemies in each level so that large, more open areas don't feel as empty. The more straightforward paths should be left mostly the same in order to not mess with any of the time trial stuff, but you should definitely notice an uptick in enemies when exploring and looking for collectibles. Change 2. And this is the big one. Make it so killing enemies makes them drop a single yarn ball. This obviously wouldn't apply to enemies such as the cars in level 3, since you can't kill them, but any normal enemies should drop a collectible when you defeat them. This would make killing them actually important to the gameplay, rather than just being homing attack fodder. Currently, Bubsy 4D has a set amount of yarn balls per level, and I wouldn't add any more to that total in order to not mess up any of the shop stuff. I would simply say to take yarn balls from less important parts of the levels and give them to enemies instead. Any yarn balls used to make pathways should not be touched, but I'm sure every level has a few yarn balls that can be moved over to enemies as drops instead. Just like in Spyro, these enemies you kill would respawn if you replay the levels, but they would no longer drop anything. Section B. I only have one idea for a change here, and it's essentially a variation on Spyro's combat system, adapted for Bubsy 4D. These changes, like I said, probably fall out of the scope of where the game currently is in development, but I thought I'd mention them anyway. Okay, so currently in Bubsy 4D, you can kill woolies by pouncing on them or rolling into them. I think you should be able to do either of these attacks to take out most enemies in the game, but I do believe there should be some variation occasionally. Just like how Spyro has some enemies that require one of his specific attacks, this idea would have some of the enemies in the game require Bubsy to defeat them in a certain way. There could be some woolies with spikes or fire on their head that would hurt Bubsy if he tried to pounce at them, but he could easily deal with them by using the roll. And there could be other enemies that wear armor, or maybe have a thick coat of sheep wool that would make rolling into them a pointless effort, requiring Bubsy to pounce at them. Even adding just a few of these simple variations would go a long way to make the combat in Bubsy 4D feel a lot better without sacrificing any of the simplicity. This is also assuming the later game has some harder to deal with woolies, since I do think they should absolutely get harder to deal with as you close in on the end of the game. If they're still doing the same old dumb attack from the first level in the last level, like what are we doing? And yeah, those are my ideas to tweak Bubsy 4D's enemies to be a bit more engaging. Hopefully that all made sense. Even if none of these changes are implemented before launch, I'm sure I'm going to adore the full game regardless, but it would definitely be nice to see this aspect of the gameplay addressed. Anyway, that's pretty much it from me. Thank you all so much for watching. I have no idea when I'll be back to posting on this channel regularly, but I hope my usual viewers can excuse this weird video just this once. Alright, that's it for real this time. Bye everybody!
Gun Ball Death Rip!